7 minutes after 7. This is your Community Watch on Focus 94.3. We do have online now Mr. Emmanuel-Bombande, who is the Executive Director of the West African Network for Peace. Mr. Bombande, good evening.
Hello, good evening.
And thanks for joining us here.
Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Bombande, we looking at our chiefs and conflict resolution. Now, the National Security Advisor, Brigadier Nunu Mensah, is reported to have said that chieftaincy institutions in Ghana is gradually turning to major source of conflict and tension in the country. What would be your own assessment of chieftaincy and conflict resolution in the country?
No, my view is that it is rather the refusal to acknowledge how the chieftaincy institution needs an increased level of capacity to deal with its conflicts. In other words, it is not the institution that is becoming more conflictual, but it is the complex political environment that has to deal with how we continue to sustain the institution. And for that matter, for the institution to have its own internal capacity to deal with its conflicts. So there will always be conflicts, and it is not going to immediately end as long as we are competing for resources, and when those resources are scarce, and whether at the level of the regions or at the level of the different paramountcies, this competition is exacerbated by other factors including politics. We must appreciate that these tensions exist. The question is, what is the capacity to deal with these conflicts? And that is what is not present. It's not because the institution in itself has become more conflictual. Okay, but
so what you're saying is that chiefs are not being given the necessary power in this country. Do you see a conflict between constitutional rule and chieftaincy in the country?
I would respond to this question by giving a quick preface. What you see happening is the increasing competition between the development of the modern state of Ghana as democracy continues to mature, and how that modern state has to now engage with the traditional state. Because the modern state was carved out or emerged out of the traditional state. The traditional state overwhelmingly is intact in terms of how Ghanaians identify themselves in terms of their well-being in relationship to their various paramountcies. And yet, it is the modern state that defines governance, issues around the rule of law, and the standards and principles that inform democratic governance. What we have not done is to appreciate this and create the mechanisms that allows a coexistence between the modern state and the traditional state. And underlining all this, therefore, is the institutional capacity to be able to deal with conflicts, whether these conflicts are pertaining to the traditional state or whether they find themselves in areas that are related to the modern state, such as the competition in multi-party democracy. And for me, this is the issue. And it comes from a legacy in which we think that the way you deal with conflict is when you have a cohesive machinery available to suppress violence. And that is purely a security matter in which we are dealing with the role of the police, the role of the military. But our own traditional mechanisms, such as dialogue, such as the concept of the Akan adage of Abrewa, in terms of voting and as the old lady, all those things are relegated to the background as the state is modern. And I think this time we went back to the mechanisms for conflict resolution that are informed by our own indigenous practices, so that we then have the capacity to deal with these issues, rather than making what I would call a simplification of the challenge. So it is easy to simplify the fact that chieftaincy is beginning to have more and more conflict. You are just simplifying it. What we need to do is to understand it from its complexity. And from its complexity, we develop the capacity to respond and deal with it.
Okay, you're talking of modern trends. That means you agree with Brigadier Joseph Numensa, who says that modern trends have affected that. But let's look at situations where the conflicts are within or between the chiefs. How do you marry that with your concern of modern trends?
Yes, I will illustrate it this way. What is happening is that the modern state, as we talk about, cannot divorce itself from the fact that within it exists the traditional state. And that traditional state has found expression in the arrangements of the various regional houses of chiefs. Maybe before even the regional houses of chiefs, you begin with the traditional councils, up to the regional houses of chiefs, to the national house of chiefs. And I think it is good wisdom that we separate how we deal with internal matters in this traditional sense with the modern. In other words, the modern state, in terms of its executive arm of government, cannot interfere in how conflicts are dealt with in the traditional state. What for me is lacking is that we are expressing this merely on paper, but we are not giving it what it takes for a functioning that is effective of these mechanisms. For example, I remember once in Tamale, and on an issue related to the paramountcy of Bimbila, the reason why the Judicial Committee of the Regional House of Chiefs could not sit down was simply because none of them would take their own money and travel to Tamale for that assignment. And so the Regional House of Chiefs is handicapped by resources as minimal as the transportation fare of the members of the Judicial Committee. And so the whole judicial system related to the traditional mechanism has no capacity, has no expertise, and therefore you should not be surprised that conflicts within the traditional system continue to be sustained. Now, when it comes to the modern state, we understand dealing with conflicts only through the use of the police, which is reactive and which often seeks to suppress violence. But borrowing from that must be the capacity to be able to engage through dialogue. Just one second. Yeah, hello?
Okay, we'll try to get Mr. Bombande back on the line. It's 26 minutes to 8. Okay, he's back online. Yeah, you can carry on from where you left off, Mr. Bombande.
Yes. And so if you look at the modern state, the institutions of the state to deal with conflict are purely reactive, and that is the police and the other arms of the security agencies. Now, the point I'm trying to draw here is that the role of those agencies, by its own definition, even if you look at the Constitution, is reactive. Reactive meaning that unless the violence occurs, they do not operate. They are not operational. So in Troubledom, the police arrive to make sure that life is protected and property is protected. But the interest of the police, or the role of the police, was not to work towards the prevention of the violence in the first place. So the question then is, why are we not making sure that in the institutions of the modern state, we have the capacity to prevent violence, which is also helping to prevent the abuse of human rights, and the police therefore are able to play their role more effectively and more comprehensively. And the reason I say this is because we blame the police when violence occurs, but in their role, they are supposed to maintain law and order. And so it is only when law and order is breached that we should see them.
Okay.
That what are we doing when we saw the signs that law and order was going to be breached?